you. I'm so honored to be here. It was an incredible thrill to be invited and to be able to come here. And I want to thank Professor In-Seop Shin, Director of the Institute, Dr. Senjun Lee, who invited me, and also people who helped to make my visit possible, Young-Sung Lee, who helped with logistics, and Yuli Kim, such a capable translator who helped with such an insightful tour and a great academic discussion yesterday. Also, thank you all who joined us last night for dinner, for listening to stories about my research. I hope to hear things about your research as we share later today. With such an outstanding faculty and such promising graduate students and young professionals, the Institute can be a global powerhouse, and it's an honor to be here to be part of that. Thank you. My talk today, I come from a long way away, as you know, and I'm very excited to make my first trip to Korea. To make it easier for you, oops, the cup's a bit turned on. Oh, it's on. I thank you for helping me by speaking and listening in English, because I don't speak Korean, I'm sorry. But my slides have key terms and phrases listed to try to make it easier for you so that you can understand my words and you can listen and follow along. As you may know, I'm from Los Angeles in California in the United States. It's a long way from here. And in fact, throughout my career as a student, as a graduate student, and also as a faculty member for the last 20 years now, my research has focused on Los Angeles, on California, on the American West, and on the United States. So not on Korea. My research is deeply empirical work. I dive deeply into my topics. This means my work is grounded in local context in Los Angeles or in California. Maybe that might make my research seem unconnected to people as far away as Korea, because the cultural context, the history is so different. Sometimes the things I do research about, they may not exist in Korea. But one of the strengths of contemporary cultural geography and mobility scholarship is that our vibrant research methods and our compelling theoretical engagements enable our empirical research to reach beyond the local, to reach outside of California, all the way maybe to Korea. So my talk today is about restoring antique motorcycles, fixing antique motorcycles, but it's also about research methods, about how our research is done. It is about autoethnography as a method, which is the practice, which means studying one's own research practices. And it's about collaborative research between a scholar and a practitioner. My work is also about theoretical engagements in mobility scholarship. It's about materiality, about enthusiasms, about making, and about love, all of these theoretical engagements. Those are all topics that have gained a lot of attention in cultural geography in recent years. My hope is that by presenting methodologically transparent research that is theoretically engaged, I can help you to understand something about restoring antique motorcycles and about contemporary cultural geography and mobility scholarship. This paper is co-authored by my partner, Paul Greenstein. He's not a geographer. He has no PhD. He is a mechanic. He repairs and restores antique cars and motorcycles, and he makes neon signs. Since 2010, we have collaborated together on research and publications. This paper is our fourth paper that we've written together, and it's grounded very much in our lives together. We begin with restoration. Restoration, making something old like new again, is extraordinary in the life of a thing. All things are made or manufactured. Most see maintenance or repair. Some see conservation and even modification, but few ever undergo restoration. In this paper, we use the restoration stories of 3 antique Indian motorcycles to reveal restoration as a dynamic, aesthetic, and political process that links restorers to communities of enthusiasm centered on the agentic materiality of the things they restore and to labors of love and devotion. To do so, we work autoethnographically, situating case studies of 3 antique motorcycles within 4 areas of literature: making, enthusiasms, materiality, and love. We begin with the practice of making, showing how restoration, like other forms of making, requires extensive expertise and skill. Though some makers and restorers profit from their work, makers are often amateurs. So we link making to geographies of enthusiasms and the devotion of enthusiasts. We next present a brief history of restoration, pointing to the restoration of mechanical things and situating motorcycle restoration within that movement. Then, because restoration is an embodied practice, we engage autoethnographic methods to illuminate these practices. This allows us to show how, while the mechanical objects of restoration appear inert, their formative materiality guides, inspires, and also hinders their restoration. We narrate the restoration stories of 3 American motorcycles: a 1937 Indian Sport Scout, a 1939 Indian Chief, and a 1910 Indian, chosen to explore the politics, ethics, and aesthetics in restoration practices. All 3 bikes could be sold at a profit, but their cultural, historic, and community and emotional values may be more significant than their monetary values. And that leads to our 4th area of literature. Placing restoration within communities of enthusiasm reveals a culturally situated, skilled practice that works with agentic materiality in labors of love and devotion. We begin by introducing each concept, its definitions, and its contemporary literature. Recently, scholars have shown growing interest in the creative practices of making, the skilled crafting, fabricating, and reconstruction of materials that bring a thing into being. This work seeks to return the embodied tasks of handwork and manual labor to focus in a way different from examinations of manufacturing. These are efforts that seek to validate the embodied practices and material knowledge that making exacts. A focus on making serves as a cultural turn, a humanities turn, focusing attention on maker's practice and validating the deep relationship with materials that lie at making's heart. As geographers Chantal Carr and Chris Gibson have indicated, emphasizing the maker together with the materials, their skilled manipulation and their agency draws attention to the lives of materials, the non-linear, culturally embedded biographies of commodities, and the details of assembling and manipulating materials. Thus, looking at making opens the bonds between material and skill, between thing and person. The scholarship on making portrays it with praise because it's blossoming in the global north, because it celebrates overlooked craft traditions, because it's often practiced for pleasure, not profit, and because it's so network and community-based. Making, to these scholars, serves as an empowering response to our throwaway society and our distance from ordinary production. It is a way of defying conventions, enjoying life, and solving its problems. As anthropologist Daniel Miller put it, made objects can reveal the sheer fun, imagination, and brilliance of craft making, for they're founded in the art of care, the care for made things that is a cousin to the care we retain for other people, for our environment, and for its future. Significantly, that care need not be paid for. Although makers might work for profit or for a living, they also work for pleasure, not profit, just for the love of it as hobbyists or enthusiasts. Enthusiasms, also called hobbies, are the pursuits of those who engage a topic for pleasure, not profit. In many areas, enthusiasts become experts, devoting their energies to exacting accuracy. They're described as dedicated. Enthusiasms are geographical phenomena, for though enthusiasts may labor alone, they find community with like-minded individuals. They're linked through networks of enthusiasts, articulated spatially through club and society meetings, public outreach events, and gatherings of those who share the passion, as well as through online forums and collecting practices. Significant for this paper is the fact that enthusiasms, as geographer Hilary Joghagen has demonstrated, are also fundamentally emotional pursuits. Looking at enthusiasms can reveal the love nurtured between people and things. And so it is to love that we next turn. Making and enthusiasms have been cast in a romantic glow. And it is precisely that romance we seek here to highlight. We do so by engaging with a topic only few geographers write about, the geographies of love. Here we join Carrie Ann Morrison, Linda Johnston, and Robin Longhurst in efforts to take love seriously as a subject of our scholarship. For, as Deb Thien has explained, love involves specific spatial practices that attach one to another. Love connects. Love can flourish between people, but also between people and things. As we demonstrate, object love is a profound process that shapes people, places, and things. In what follows, we reveal how motorcycle restoration opens up a romance between material and maker, and show how enthusiasts extend love to what we call material devotion. First, we provide context for that in sketching the history of restoration. Restoration, widely practiced today worldwide, has not been widely written about by geographers. Hundreds of articles, books, videos, and websites guide a person through the restoration of almost anything. But despite histories of restoration craft in specific areas, outside of architecture and art, little has been published about the broader histories and geographies of restoration as a practice. Restoration, as it is understood today, involves returning a thing to an original appearance and working condition, reversing any non-original modifications, and using original or original style materials to do so. As a practice, restoration is literally ancient, emerging in the Western world first in classical Greece, with restorations of buildings, temples, and sculptures. But anything old can be restored. And across restoration's long history, styles and tastes for what restoration should be have shifted with the tastes of the times. What stands out is a division between things individually produced and things made by mass manufacture. The deep perceptual chasm between handcraft labor and mass manufacture, between a work of art and a mass-produced mechanical thing, between highbrow and lowbrow, replicates itself in restoration. Buildings and temples, for example, have undergone restoration for millennia, and paintings and fine art have undergone restoration for hundreds of years. These examples of architecture and fine art are key. These one-off, typically highbrow works of artists and master craftspeople have been the focus, historically, of nearly all restoration efforts. Restoration of mass-produced mechanical things began as an enthusiasm, one substantially gained only in the 20th century, for it was only then that an increasing number of mass-produced mechanical things became too old to use and became also antique. By the turn of the 20th century, all sorts of mass-produced mechanical things needed more than maintenance and repair. They needed restoration. But in order to warrant such efforts, to warrant restoration, they had to transcend being old and outdated and become recognized as valuable and collectible. In the 20th century, all sorts of mass-produced mechanical things underwent a dual and inverse transition from working to worn, and then from worthless to worthy. As we will show, the practices of restoration link historical knowledge and understanding of historical aesthetics with mechanical expertise and handcraft skill. Like other practices of skilled making, those together are typically mastered only after years or even decades of experience. Restoration must be learned iteratively and haptically by hand. To convey this kind of expertise, we use autoethnographic methods, the studied, focused, and critical examination of some 4 decades of our own practices in an analysis that grows directly from the materiality of our 3 motorcycle case studies. Materiality, the term used to encompass the lives and the thingness of things, is gaining interest among geographers and other scholars. Things, according to these works, have agency, what Jane Bennett terms a vibrancy of their own. Nevertheless, in our rush to embrace materiality, it has at times led to uncritical acceptance of matter's agency, what geographer Dydia Kelly calls surface geographies, that overlook political engagements and stop short of evaluation. Those who, to Tolia Kelly, engage well with materiality do so by demonstrating a clear politics of doing materiality and a transparent account of research practices. For geographer Nadia Bartolini, on the other hand, one problem with vibrant matter is that we may lose touch with the cultural context of things. By pushing to the side the social life of objects to emphasize inherent vibrancy, matter can be separated from place, history, and culture. We believe that a focus on autoethnography, on making, because it is culturally and spatially situated, can be used to highlight matter's agency. In this paper, by accounting deeply for the vibrancy of motorcycles and their parts, and by carefully situating them in their historical cultural contexts, and revealing the practices by which we and others make them matter, we aspire to achieve the aims these other scholars have preferred. To do so, we first offer a brief history of the Indian Motorcycle Company. Notice that the name of the company was first spelled with no R. So that's their original name. Next, we show how a community of Indian enthusiasts forwarded the mark after the company's demise. And then we situate co-author Paul in that community and turn to the practices of making involved in Paul's restoration of 3 different Indians. The history of the Indian Motorcycle Company has been well documented. Founded by bicyclists in the early 20th century, they made their first Indian in 1901, becoming pioneers of design and performance. By the 19-teens, they were the world's largest motorcycle company and most influential. Though they innovatively built new models until the 1950s, by the 1920s, they were beset by problems from which they never recovered. The company changed hands several times and ceased motorcycle production in 1953. Despite histories of the company, the history of Indian enthusiasm is not well documented. To trace it and to show what this kind of enthusiasm can do, we use autoethnography, mustering decades of personal and embodied engagement with Indian motorcycles and with the international community of Indian restorers and enthusiasts. By the mid-1950s, Indian was defunct, but its enthusiasts were not. Dedicated riders remained true to their mark, rebuilding and eventually restoring their motorcycles. Brand loyalty among Indian enthusiasts is legendary, but not merely because of badge loyalty. The differences between Indians and Harley Davidsons, Indians' last remaining competitor, are partly aesthetic. Indians had more color choices and had a more streamlined form, but the differences are also functional. The practices of riding them are very different. For example, Indian V-twin engines provide smooth firing impulses, particularly at idle, while Harleys are rough. Then there are the different controls. Indians, developed first, are natural for right-handed riders, whereas Harleys became known as suicide shift for the awkward and imbalanced motions required. And third, Indian front ends are stable, while Harleys produced high-speed death wobbles. Between Indians and Harleys, the rides themselves are as distinctive as the bikes are in their appearances. Such significant differences in materiality, in form, function, and performance gained Indian a following of loyal enthusiasts, one that remains vibrant to this day. For Indian enthusiasts, this initially meant simply continuing to ride their motorcycles. But as years passed and parts aged and wore, just riding became less simple. Maintenance led to repair, and repair led to restoration. In the 1950s, just as Indians stopped making motorcycles, motorcyclists across the US were developing an interest in bikes that were old. For Indians, when restoration began, people like Sammy Pierce, called Mr. Indian, and Floyd Clymer, both based in California, strove to stock as many old parts as possible. This was important because of the tangible materiality of the parts. They were well made and durable, and this was underlain by Indians' decision to make parts interchangeable. You could switch out parts from different years. In the 1950s and 60s, restoration chiefly involved keeping something running rather than meticulously returning something to its original condition. But by the 1960s and 70s, the stashes of old parts were running out, and Indian enthusiasts and maker engineers like Bob Stark, also in California, had begun sourcing what are called renewable parts, things like spark plugs, by adapting parts made from other vehicles. They were also beginning to make reproduction parts, like taillight glass and floorboard rubber. Enough old Indians were now on the road still riding, with enough problems with broken taillights and worn-out floorboard rubber that makers like Stark could profitably reproduce easy-to-make parts. By the early 1970s, growing Indian enthusiasm led to increasing Indian making. Shops emerged like Starklight Cycle and Ken Young, both in the Los Angeles area, specializing in Indian motorcycle restorations, modern shops specializing in old bikes. They built their expertise working on bikes that were already vintage, providing services to customers who wanted to ride old motorcycles. And those customers grew into a varied group. Some had the expertise to work on their own bikes and came in for parts. Others came for service and repair. And still others bought bikes, restored, serviced, and repaired by others. The enthusiasm was expanding beyond just riders to collectors. Initially, those collectors were motorcyclists themselves. They simply began collecting the bikes they liked and stretched those interests to older and older motorcycles. Riders, racers, and mechanics became collectors, like Bud Eakins. Bud Eakins was a legendary racer, stuntman, and California Triumph motorcycle dealer. You may know of Eakins. That's him. It was Eakins in the most famous motorcycle stunt in movie history in the 1963 film The Great Escape, who posed as his good friend, rider Steve McQueen, jumping and riding a motorcycle over a barbed wire fence and then crashing it on purpose to escape the Nazis in the movie. So that's Eakins. Eakins built a huge collection of antique motorcycles, considered by the 1980s the most valuable collection in America. And Eakins rode the bikes. Once a few notable riders like Eakins began collecting, the enthusiasm spread. Antique motorcycle restoration, like other hobbies, spread via enthusiasts and linked professionals to become a world connected at all levels. These early rider restorers relied on stocks of what are called NOS parts, new old stock. Original Indian parts, never used, sometimes still in the original packaging like these. Even today, it remains possible to buy brand new original parts for an Indian motorcycle. But NOS was never a reliable source for parts. Always just a shaky supply chain, and by the 70s it was beginning to be replaced by the adaptability of other parts, and eventually by parts reproduction. The demand for restored motorcycles would be, by the early 21st century, great enough to reward the investment. As an example, the distinctive looking mechanical brake light switch that Indian used from about 1934 to 1940. It also fit many cars. But by the 1950s, hydraulic switches were being used instead, and the parts were no longer available. Stocks of old ones depleted, and by the 1970s, no one could find or had even seen an available original Indian brake light switch. So instead, riders used universal switches, switches that fit many models of cars and motorcycles. These switches worked. They were not correct, but they worked. You had brake lights. It was not until 2005 that an exacting reproduction brake light switch was made. As Indian enthusiasm grew, capabilities for accurate restoration grew as well. Over time, the availability of skilled makers led to the present situation. Today, very few parts are not available. Across the US and around the world, Indian enthusiasts continue to restore and ride original Indian motorcycles. So next, we detail the restoration biographies of 3 Indians and show how the material agency of the bikes and their parts are culturally situated in the biography of their restorer and in the times, place, and community of enthusiasts in which he restored them. And that in turn reveals the love and devotion that restoration commands. The enthusiasm for restoration typically begins with an intimate geography and an emotional material bond. For some, it begins in the home, often with a father-son project. Machine restoration is and always has been overwhelmingly gendered male. For others, restoration is spark ignited. Material intimacy can just as well occur in public. And so it was with Paul. In the late 1960s, Paul, then 14 years old, saw Eakins' shop and that collection of antique motorcycles. Allured, he started hanging out, a common way to learn an enthusiasm. Then, one day in 1973, a customer came in with a 1937 Indian Chief. Paul remembered a streamlined bike with swooping fenders that looked like it would go. This was the first Indian Paul had seen, and when the man kick-started the bike to leave, the distinctive sound ratcheting Kickstarter sound entranced him. He was 18, and he decided immediately, right then, that he wanted an Indian motorcycle. That was it. Paul had landed in a world of enthusiasts and makers, a community both local and beyond local, all of whom shared interests, and many of whom were openly willing to help each other simply because of the motorcycles. To have an Indian, Paul knew that because he was a young kid with no money, with limited finances, he'd have to start at the bottom. With a non-running, unrestored bike, he would have to learn to restore, ride, and maintain. As is common for enthusiasts, he realized that to have an Indian, he had to become a maker-restorer himself. So one Sunday, Paul saw a newspaper ad for a 1937 Indian. Arriving at the address in the advertisement, others were already leaving. "Don't bother," they said. He thought it must be sold, but he asked why. "It's a scout," they said. Scouts were the smaller but sportier Indians. The larger chiefs had always been more desirable. But young Paul didn't know much about Indian motorcycles, and he didn't know the difference. He just recognized the streamlined form from Eakins' shop. The bike was nearly complete, but it showed its hard life. It had no paint, no seat, rotten tires. The floorboards were destroyed. It had been in a fire. It was missing its front fender and had only part of its rear fender, and it didn't run. But it was was mostly together, assembled as a complete bike. The seller asked significant money, especially for a teenager in 1974, so Paul worked a minimum wage summer job to repay a loan from his brother. Indian restoration, like other enthusiasms, involves many commitments. This financial one was Paul's first. But Paul's acquisition was not celebrated, it was disparaged. His friends said, "It'll never run." As is characteristic of enthusiasts of all kinds, the insults of unbelievers serve as inspiration. Looking up the engine numbers revealed that the bike was a 1937 Sports Scout. It was the boy racer model of its day, a cool bike. Asking after parts, like a front fender, Paul learned of Young's shop. This was the chopper era in American motorcycles, when everyone removed the fenders to build a chopper. But Young supplied an original fender. These donor parts from other bikes helped make Paul's bike more complete and more original. Young led Paul to Stark and Pierce, the other early Indian maker restorers. There were close connections among enthusiasts. From all these fellow enthusiasts, Paul acquired needed parts and began to learn the skills required in motorcycle restoration. It took about a year for Paul to restore the Sports Scout to running condition, though not to a condition that would be called restored by today's standards. Restoration was different then. For example, the bike had been radically altered in the 1950s, removing the front fender and rear fender tip, which Paul changed, but also changing the cylinders to later, better cooling military cylinders and narrowing the handlebars for a racier look. These were two modifications Paul kept. He left them intact as part of the bike's biography. It now had new tires and a new seat, new fenders, along with new paint and pinstripe. Its black color and gold stripe Paul decided on from the remnants of the original paint that he found. Based on the original paint, this is a common restoration practice. But many other parts were just cleaned up. Paul re-chromed some parts, but was able to polish others. And as a novice, as a beginner, he made some mistakes. The oil pump should have been unpolished nickel, but not knowing that, Paul had it chromed and polished. Many people didn't notice these mistakes in those days. In 1976, Paul won an award for Best Unrestored Motorcycle. Though the Sports Scout had many parts recently added and several that were non-stock, it had the appearance of a very original bike. As is common with many antique vehicles, the Sports Scout came with original paperwork. In this case, a California title from 1943 and a registration card from 1951. These revealed that the bike had first been registered in Minnesota, then traded to a Los Angeles shop, and purchased in 1943 by one of the mechanics, a man named Julian Doty. Restorers are typically interested in the histories of their vehicles, so Paul tracked Doty to a car repair shop in Hollywood and rode the bike there. When he arrived, two men appeared, and the younger one, seeing the antique bike, said, "Hey, look, it's an Indian motorcycle." The older man said right away, "That's my Indian motorcycle." He instantly recognized the bike he'd bought in 1943 and had ridden for 15 years. Doty revealed some of the Sports Scouts' secrets. The side stand, for example, should be cast with the letters Indian. But on this bike, it just read India. Dodi explained that was from an accident. He got in a crash. The side stand was run over and broken, and when Dodi welded it back together, the end disappeared. Those side stands were one of the first parts reproduced. Paul left it that way to this day, because even injuries can be considered historically or culturally significant and therefore worthy of saving. Restorers are often sensitive to the biographies of the machines they restore. Beyond technical accuracy, they seek to validate the material's life experiences. Paul and Dodi remained in contact until Dodi's death more than 30 years later. Enthusiasms foster strong community material bonds. But not everyone appreciated Paul's efforts. In Indian restoration in the 1970s, it was wrong to do it right. Because he had not chromed the wheel rims, front forks, or handlebars, but had painted them black, as on the original, some said of Paul's Scout with disdain, "You should see his bike, it's all black." Partly, this was because Indian offered custom options for paint and plating. For extra money, you could order any color. Though few paid that money during the Great Depression when the bike was new, by the 1970s, for people restoring bikes, many indulged their fantasies and contemporary tastes of what a motorcycle could look like. So in the 60s and 70s, most Indian restorations were comparatively inauthentic. It took the individual efforts of restorers to change the aesthetics of restoration practice. Restoration, like other practices of making, is not static. It is instead an embodied craft, learned and polished in the life worlds of restorers themselves. Today, after more than 40 years from when Paul first restored the Sports Scout, it shows even more scars of its life experiences, with its period adaptations, restoration mistakes, and hard road miles. It would today not be seen as a meticulously restored motorcycle, but it remains an artifact of its times, and Paul still rides it. By the turn of the 21st century, Indian restoration had changed a lot. Inventories of new old stock parts were mostly depleted, but with a stronger market for vintage motorcycles, parts reproducers had stepped into the void. Because more people were restoring Indians, bikes in barn find condition, like the Sports Scout had been, were becoming vastly more expensive. But at the same time, reproduced parts that could be used to complete a bike built from parts were becoming less expensive and more available. So basket case bikes, bikes that start their life as a basket of parts, were not cheap, but more common and possible to complete. Such a bike was Paul's 39 Chief. He started in the mid-1990s with just one part, a frame, acquired by buying and selling and trading other motorcycles and parts. By then, Paul had already restored 2 other Indians, and the 39 would fill a gap in what was becoming a collection. Paul's enthusiasm was growing, with his restoration skills. And like the Indian enthusiasts who'd inspired him, so was his collection. Building a motorcycle from parts is not cheap. In fact, it's generally more expensive and more time-consuming than buying a complete bike. But for those, like enthusiasts, able to stick with a project for many years, it can be more attainable. Because parts, expertise, and labor are acquired and paid for in hundreds of small payments. For the 39, Paul spent a decade, 10 years, just accumulating parts, building a stash that would eventually make the Chief a viable project. Some parts were original: the wheels, the front fork, fuel tanks, glove box, handlebars, and most of the engine and transmission. Others were reproduced: the fenders, chain guard, front leaf spring, the outer primary case, and expendable parts like tires. But even accumulating parts takes skill. Because motorcycles were constantly changing, different parts changed for different motorcycles at different times, and not all these changes are documented. For example, in 1939, Chiefs grew heavier, so Indian added more pieces to their leaf springs, and they advertised better suspension for that year. In 1939, Indian also changed to Bakelite plastic housings on their high-beam, low-beam light switches. Before and after that, they used steel housings. That was something they never advertised. Restorers, like other devoted enthusiasts, must learn these details. Nobody tells you it's not in a book. As with other forms of embodied and practiced knowledge, its acquisition is often unremarkable. Paul doesn't remember how he learned about the Bakelite switch. Restoration, like other practices of making, is a form of skilled labor that grows with doing, with experience, and with interaction. By the time Paul built the 39 Chief, he was more skilled. On the Sport Scout, he had someone else build the engine. But for the Chief, he built the engine himself. These were skills learned on other bikes, tested with skilled input from other restorers. In communities of enthusiasm, skills may be shared among friends and graciously passed to younger generations. In the early 1990s, the prices of Indians had increased dramatically because of purchases by famous buyers who paid high prices that raised market values. And this, in turn, accelerated the parts reproduction market. For example, once Indian script logo outer primary cases, these parts cover the chain that drives the clutch and transmission. So significant piece for the bike. Once these cases became difficult to find at any price, the values of Indians increased, it became worthwhile to reproduce difficult to make non-renewable parts like outer primaries. Globalization was an additional stimulus. For parts reproducers, lower labor costs in developing countries led to increased profits and increased diversity of parts. For example, most reproduction Indian engine pistons are now made in Taiwan, while most reproduction Indian cylinders are made in India. But even with reproduced parts, restoration demands patience. In restoration, even if everything goes smoothly, everything, absolutely everything must be taken apart, put together in mock-up and trial, taken apart again, and put together again at least once. But restoring a basket case bike, creating a bike made from parts never mated together before, introduces material challenges. For example, on Paul's 39 Chief, at first assembly, the front wheel was 1/4 inch off center. You can see how the center of the tire doesn't line up with the center of the fender. It's a little bit off center. So he first assembled it, it was 1/4 inch apart. He was dismayed. So he assembled, disassembled, and reassembled it 5 times, trying to make it line up. Each time it got closer, a little bit closer, but eventually no room was left for improvement. Whether or not the wheel was that way on the original bike, it will always be that way now. With a basket case, more problems arise, and restoration becomes even more demanding. Restoration requires patience and devotion. Restoration of a basket case bike, just that much more. Some restoration decisions are aesthetic. They demand experience with historical styles and taste. Motorcycle companies like Indian offered options in paint colors and plating. And restorers must decide how to restore their machines. For example, wheel rims could be painted, cadmium plated, or chrome plated. In the 70s, most restorers favored the brightness of chrome, but in the 30s, most bikes would have had cheaper options. So Paul chose painted rims and cad-plated spokes. This was also an aesthetic choice. The black rims and cad spokes would attract little attention, and together they would focus attention on the paint on the rest of the bike. In 1939, Indian offered a special 2-color paint job, and Paul chose that to lend elegance to the streamlined forms of the bike's fuel tanks and fenders. Aesthetic choices made just once, but considered over decades of experience. Restoring a motorcycle like this as an enthusiast is a labor of love and devotion. Labor costs are not recouped because they don't need to be. The extraordinary investment of time, energy, and skill is made for the love of the motorcycles. For those less well off, enthusiasm-based restoration rather than paid professional restoration may be the only way to own and ride antique motorcycles. When we wrote this paper, the 39 Chief was nearly finished. It was awaiting not skill, but the money required to finish it. Materiality can slow a project's completion. Paul finished the bike last year in 2018 and rides it today. The final case study. In 1998, New York's Guggenheim Art Museum, a very prestigious museum, opened an exhibit called The Art of the Motorcycle. This rocketed antique motorcycles from the world of riders and enthusiasts to that of wealthy and newly minted collectors, those who could afford to have their bikes restored and even over-restored. This fueled a cosmic pissing contest where motorcycles became more and more authentically and meticulously restored to a point where even machine screw heads were being faithfully copied from extinct 1930s types. Once such perfection was achieved, there was no farther to climb up but down. And the collectible market opened to unrestored original bikes. Though in principle, anything can be restored to look new, By the end of the 20th century, more people began to appreciate that a motorcycle and anything else can only be original once. Only once. Because complete, unmolested, original motorcycles in good condition are rare, that stoked the market, escalating prices and desirability of unrestored original motorcycles. It was the final frontier and a sea change for Indian enthusiasts. That interest in unrestored motorcycles in turn set the stage for a different kind of restoration. In the late 1990s, Paul acquired as a gift a thoroughly rusted early Indian frame and front end that had been found by a friend in a desert trash dump. An early bike was just what Paul wanted, but how to restore a bike this early and that far gone? The gift itself was a generous one. Parts that old are scarce and valuable. But the giver exacted a promise, a commitment to restore the bike, a commitment that demanded money and time. It took nearly 10 years, along with skill and devotion. It was a project that would challenge and extend Paul's knowledge and abilities in new ways, involving new forms of making and different interactions with materials. Careful investigation revealed it to be a 1910 Indian, or part of one, so Paul proceeded again to accumulate the appropriate parts. This was a time before modern motorcycles. 1910 Indians have pedal starters like mopeds and no clutch. Because these bikes are today very rare, and because they're not very rideable in modern traffic, fewer parts are reproduced for them. Original parts are so rare, they're almost non-existent, and online searches were not successful. To source parts, Paul fell back on old-fashioned methods. For several years, he went to antique motorcycle swap meets, gatherings of enthusiasts. There he could talk to sellers of parts he didn't need, asking about parts he did need. So swap meets bring about connections to parts and connections to other enthusiasts and their parts. Over years of searching, Paul eventually found an engine and proceeded with restoration. Parts acquisition, particularly for something this old and rare, is a labor-intensive, skilled effort that cannot be accomplished entirely online. It involves building connections to other enthusiasts, and always good luck. But not all parts could be found. Some would have to be made by Paul just for this one motorcycle. Parts like a chain guard, a front wheel, the rear fender, and fender braces, and even rivets would have to be made. In the case of the chain guard, none was available, original or reproduction, nor was one available for Paul to borrow from someone else and copy. Looking at photographs and measuring existing parts, he realized it was made up from geometric shapes, and that by extrapolating, he could reproduce it himself from sheet steel. Still, material resistance intervened. The first effort failed, the second was closer, and the third one finally fit and is today fitted on the bike. Once Paul had accumulated enough parts, questions arose about how to restore the bike. The rust was, on the one hand, not desirable, but on the other, it lent the bike a luster that revealed its life history. By the early 2000s, this kind of patina was beginning to become a positive attribute, not something to be undone in restoration, but instead to be carefully retained. Then when other parts turned up in similarly rusted condition, like the rear wheel and front fender, Paul made a radical aesthetic and ethical decision to restore the entire bike as if it had been found in the trash, aging or painting as if aged, even parts newly made. The 1910, completed in time for its 100th birthday, looks today every bit its age. The original and reproduced wheels and fenders appear identically old-looking. In 2010, this was unusual in motorcycle restoration. By 2019, such practices of antiquing had spurred broad interest. The aesthetics are those of our time, as we witness the rise in value and popularity of unrestored original antique vehicles. The ethical questions arise when such interventions remain undisclosed. As in art forgery, ethical violations emerge not at creation, but at presentation or sale. For Paul, the very artistry of his restoration efforts calls him to point to the distinctions, pointing out which fender is original and which one he made. For him, the aged appearance of the new materials marks not a forgery, but an artistic achievement of his restoration craft, the interactions of materials with skill, knowledge, aesthetics, and emotion. The 1910 also represents another transition experienced by enthusiasts, from rider or user to collector. Because this motorcycle is challenging and dangerous to ride in modern traffic, Paul restored the bike not really to ride and never to sell, but just to have. The motorcycle, through restoration, has a changed social value and a changed social role. As with other enthusiasts before him, Paul restored this motorcycle in devotion to his enthusiasm for the love of Indian motorcycles. Restoring antique motorcycles will not save the world, nor was manufacturing them in the first place ever so intended, but the creative practices of making that restoration calls for, and the devotion that restoration by enthusiasts demand, may play an important role. In Carr and Gibson's words, rather than becoming increasingly marginalized and redundant, the ability to work with materials and to make, and we would add to restore, to repair or repurpose physical things are vital skills for a volatile future. In the Anthropocene world of resource scarcity and environmental uncertainty, in a de-skilling globalized economy and a throwaway society, enthusiasm-based restoration cannot be outsourced, de-skilled, automated, or even extinguished. Motorcycle restoration flourishes as a place-based, embodied, community-engaged, material-driven practice that knowingly and lovingly transforms junk and trash back into running antique motorcycles. This is what material devotion can do. Exploring motorcycle restoration as a practice of enthusiasm-driven making shows how material objects are not static, but are instead continuously becoming, and how their becoming in turn enacts social relations. The materiality of the motorcycles drives the bonds between enthusiasts and between enthusiasts and bikes. Practices of making, like motorcycle restoration, enable diverse social interactions. They nurture skills. They harness capacities for collaboration, adaptation, generosity, and sharing. They build community. The objects we have studied do something. The very materiality of these bikes draws around them a community of dedicated enthusiasts loyal to the mark who ride and restore Indians. And for Indian enthusiasts, this is a sensuous materialism. These objects are loved. Craft making like this is easy to romanticize, and the growing literature casts it in a golden glow. But this is not wrong. In a throwaway society, the fact that people can and do make anything just for the love of it is significant. And making is romantic, because making practices reveal labors of love. But love can be fickle. It's not always sustained over time. So restoration commands more. In his famous book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Robert Pirsig insists that motorcycle repair, beyond just tools, takes gumption, the shrewd and spirited resourcefulness. But for motorcycles, repair is ordinary. All motorcycles need repair. But restoration is extraordinary. It exacts demands beyond gumption, even beyond love. Motorcycle restoration exacts devotion, love, care, loyalty, and attention, all sustained over time. This means that enthusiasms like motorcycle restoration are more than mere hobbies. For the devotions of restoration by enthusiasts mobilize a politics of relating to things. In a world of runaway resource consumption and throwaway production, the ability to turn junk back into valuable and usable machines should perhaps be cherished. More than 60 years after Indians stopped manufacturing motorcycles, thousands of Indians remain vibrant and running today. Looking at motorcycle restoration reveals how material agency compels such devotion. Devoted enthusiasts, loyal to their mark and its very materiality, skilled craftspeople with deep historical and material expertise, situated in communities of enthusiasm, even when laboring alone, can make anything. Restoration by enthusiasts is limited only by devotion. Restoration's labors are both arduous and arduous and arduous, but by harnessing its devotion, ultimately you can ride. 감사합니다.